The word of the Lord is as follows. After telling this story, Jesus went on towards Jerusalem, walking ahead of his disciples. As he came to the towns of Bethphage and Bethany on the Mount of Olives, he sent 2 disciples ahead. "Go into that village over there," he told them. "As you enter it, you will see a young donkey tied there that no one has ever ridden. Untie it and bring it here. If anyone asks, 'Why are you untying that colt?' just say, 'The Lord needs it.'" So they went and found the colt just as Jesus had said. Sure enough, as they were untying it, the owners asked them, "Why are you untying that colt?" And the disciples simply replied, "The Lord needs it." So they brought the colt to Jesus and threw their garments over it for him to ride on. As he rode along, the crowd spread out their garments on the road ahead of him. When he reached the place where the road started down the Mount of Olives, all of his followers began to shout and sing as they walked along, praising God for all the wonderful miracles they had seen. "Blessings on the King who comes in the name of the Lord, peace in heaven and glory in highest heaven." But some of the Pharisees among the crowd said, "Teacher, rebuke your followers for saying things like that." He replied, "If they kept quiet, the stones along the road would burst into cheers." Thus far, the word of the Lord. You may be seated. I want to preach from this subject. Just tell your neighbor, safe. 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 The passage before us today presents one of the most layered of events in the earthly life and ministry of Jesus. It is commonly known as the triumphal entry of Jesus into Jerusalem on what we now call Palm Sunday. And this story is filled with drama. It's filled with intrigue on multiple levels. One level is that this was not the first time Jesus has been to Jerusalem. Since his birth, he's been there many times, perhaps too many to count now. The previous feast day, which was held in Jerusalem, Jesus did not enter Jerusalem in such a public manner. The animus among the religious leaders was such that at that time Jesus entered under the cover of night. He did not even go by day. And now, with the religious leaders being even more entrenched in their dislike of Jesus and more committed to effecting his demise, Jesus enters Jerusalem not under the cover of darkness, but he enters in broad daylight. Unlike other times, Jesus seems to stage this entrance. All of the gospel writers are quick to include Jesus instructing 2 disciples to go ahead of them into town where they would find a colt that had never been ridden. And it is that colt that they are to procure and bring for Jesus. And if the owner should ask why they wanted it, all that they were to say was that the Lord has need of it. With their having done so, Jesus is now portrayed as one who rides in procession towards Jerusalem. We are told that a multitude of people develop and they cheer him, shouting, "Hosanna! Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Peace in heaven and glory in the highest heaven." Now, to the person who is new to the Bible, this would appear to be merely a celebrative moment. This would just seem to be like a victory parade after someone has won a championship. But for those of us who have trafficked in the scriptures, we know better. We know that the people who shout Hosanna in this passage, in a mere 5 days, will cry, crucify him. And in our study, 40 Days of Decrease, Alicia Sholey writes, picture Jesus smiling, looking around him at the radiant faces of the 12 and the hope-filled eyes of the masses, knowing that the 12 would soon run for their lives and the masses would soon reject him. Jesus still stayed fully present for the party. She goes on to write, this quality of Christ strikes me as utterly remarkable. Honestly, she admits, I probably would have silenced all of them except for the small group of faithful Jesus followers, but not for the reasons motivated by the Pharisees. She writes, I would have insulated myself from the crowd's favor because their favor would soon falter. She concludes that statement by saying, crowds are fickle that way. In contrast, throughout his ministry and in amplified form during his Passion Week, Jesus consistently displayed an ability to receive from people in the moment what he knew would not endure. In the triumphal entry, Jesus permitted the crowd support, knowing it would soon sour. Jesus still lovingly and fully affirmed Peter's future leadership immediately after prophesying Peter's denial. Jesus still welcomed Judas to the communion table, knowing that betrayal was in his heart. In short, she writes, Jesus did not emotionally self-protect. His love did not shrink back, even when his love for a moment, or sadly for a lifetime, would be ultimately rejected. As I read that, I had to admit, I too am fascinated by how Jesus could revel and glory in a moment produced by people whom he knew would say and act in different ways on the days that would follow. Knowing people for whom he knew they were, and knowing the events to come for what they would be, Jesus still revels and takes joy in the moment. Now, the reason why I marvel at that is because if I knew what Jesus knew, I certainly would not be reveling in the moment. I wouldn't want to be around people knowing how fickle they were. I would seek to avoid them out of a desire to protect myself. And I know I'm not by myself. Just touch your neighbor and say, I can't take fickle folk for long. And it is here that Alicia Sholey highlights another fast to which we are called. It is to fast spiritual self-protection. Tell your neighbor, uh-oh. She cites psychiatrist Anthony Redding with these words: individuals who have been hurt by lost hopes tend to protect themselves against future disappointment by lowering their sights and dimming their aspirations. Going further, she states, uncertain that God will protect us, we proactively protect ourselves. To avoid further emotional and theological pain, we lower our expectations, we edit our dreams, and we shrink back from God through fear-driven planning, endless worry, hypervigilance, or the numbing of hope. There are those right now listening to me who, after being teased or ostracized for academic excellence, dumbed down and underperform simply to fit in. There are those who, after being sexually assaulted or harassed, do all that they can to downplay their physical attractiveness so as not to garner unwarranted attention. There are those who, after being disappointed by people's actions or inactions, no longer expect the highest and best, but assume the lowest and the least. And when things for which we've trusted God don't happen when we desire or as we desire, we stop asking, we stop trying, we stop working. We self-protect. And Alicia concludes with each choice to self-protect. Another layer is added to insulate our hearts from attentiveness to God's presence. Now, I must admit, not all self-protection is bad. In fact, some forms of self-protection are necessary and good. Alicia points out when we brace ourselves for an impending car accident, or run when chased by a rabid or angry animal, we are instinctively self-protecting our physical bodies. And she really admits even some forms of emotional self-protection are healthy, such as when we self-differentiate from a toxic relative. That is, when you recognize somebody is toxic, it is in your best interest to get out of their space. That is necessary self-protection. And in those examples, that is a response to danger. In short, we self-protect when we don't feel safe. But when we look at this text and Jesus' journey into Jerusalem as he's making his way towards Calvary, we see Jesus resisting a posture of spiritual self-protection in order to be present to a God-honoring moment worth celebrating. Now, friends, if it is true that actions reveal beliefs because beliefs inspire actions, what belief did Jesus have to empower him to resist being self-protective? What belief or conviction is there that helps one withstand the pull to be insular and isolated, to shrink back and to withdraw, to hide and to withhold? In other words, how can you and I fast spiritual self-protection? Well, in general, we fast spiritual self-protection by believing that we're safe with God. Yeah, tell your neighbor, safe with God. Jesus could be present to the moment of celebration with people who would betray him, deny him, and cry for his crucifixion just days later because he believed that God the Father was covering him. His safety and security were not in the people around him. His safety and security were solely in God. His trust was in God's ultimate care and consistency. And therefore, he could enjoy the moment in their presence because he felt safe with God. Unlike the multitude and even the disciples, what he saw of God on that day, he could trust to be true on the next day. How God was to him on that day, God would be to him in the days ahead. In short, God would not change. God is the same yesterday, today, and forevermore. God is who he was, and he will be who he is right now. The fast from spiritual self-protection begins and ends with a belief that you are safe with the God who does not change. So I got to ask you, how safe do you feel with God? Let that land. In what situations and on what occasions have you not felt safe with God? Because, friends, whatever those situations are, there is and will be the tendency for you to try to self-protect. Whatever aspect you don't believe is actually covered by God, you will find yourself acting in self-protective ways. You know, as I interrogate my own life, I have to admit to you that my times of anger with and displeasure towards God have been the times when I've actually felt unprotected, when I felt vulnerable. That is, the moments and episodes where God did not keep something painful from me. He didn't keep me from the death of loved ones. Didn't keep me from the pains of disappointment. Didn't keep me from experiences of betrayal or hurt. He hasn't always kept me from people who meant me harm, or from events that hurt, or from times even when I disappoint myself. And when I look at that, within that there is a strong tendency within me to self-protect. But Alicia tells me and all who are listening to me, we are called to fast and to fight that tendency with an overwhelming belief that we are safe with God. And what I've learned is what Jesus knew. The safety and the covering isn't always from. Tell your neighbor, he's about to hit you right between the eyes right now. Early in one's life with God, there is the tendency to view safety and security and covering simply in terms of the category called from. It's what God keeps you from seeing, from feeling, from knowing, from having, from happening. And as long as God keeps you from storms, from sickness, from trauma, from tragedy, you feel safe and secured and covered with God. But a real witness knows that life isn't lived very long just experiencing the from category. Because sooner or later, rain falls, storms rise, sickness occurs, difficulties come, trouble emerges, pain comes, hurt happens. Somebody can testify that the Allstate commercial just isn't a commercial. Mayhem does happen. And through those times, you discover that the category of from can't be the only category of God's safety and protection. That God's covering you with his feathers and you're trusting under his wings can't simply be found in the from category. And so what you understand is God is saying we fast spiritual protection by believing God's safety for the in category. I-N. Tell your neighbor it's in the in category. Look at it. As Jesus rode towards Jerusalem with a fickle crowd, including religious leaders who were already actively plotting his demise, he sees somebody besides the multitude, besides the religious leaders, and besides the disciples, unmentioned in the text, unnoticed by the people, unperceived by the disciples, unimagined by the religious leaders. There was somebody else in the scene with Jesus upon whom Jesus was now focusing. Do you know who that was in the scene? It's God the Father. This was the Father's scene. And as the multitude was shouting what they were shouting, God was fulfilling prophecies made centuries before. The people were shouting words that had been spoken years before, and God had them speak those words years before because God knew this time was going to come for fulfillment of a place and purpose in Jesus' life. And Jesus could enjoy the moment because he understood that while the people did not fully understand what they were doing, God was present. And God was taking joy in what they were doing. He could celebrate because he knew that God was in the moment of celebration. Friends, God's covering you isn't limited to the from category. It is also found in the in category. That is to say, you can feel safe knowing that you're not in the matter by yourself, but the Lord is in the moment with you. He is present in the moment, and he seeks to make himself present to you in the moment. In the moments of your life, he is present to fulfill the moments for your life. That is to say, he is in your moment for your moment. He is present to make the moment what he intends for the moment to be, and therefore he uses whatever is available. He uses the actions and the words of others who aren't even aware of what their actions really mean, but he knows what they mean. That's why Joseph could look at his brothers and say, what you did, you meant it for evil, but God meant it for good to save those that are alive. Jesus says you can take joy in them when your focus is on God being with you in the moment. God is doing what God wants to do with the moment. Then it does not matter who else is in the scene. You are safe because God is right there. Jesus' sense of safety was simply due to his trust that God was in the situation, but also that God was with him in the situation. Because when you look at the scene, there are several categories of people in the scene. There was the multitude of folk in the scene. There were the disciples in the scene. There were the religious leaders in the scene. And the religious leaders were there in opposition to Jesus. The multitude is there out of curiosity and consumption. The disciples are there following Jesus. But God was there with Jesus to accompany and strengthen Jesus. And therefore, Jesus did not need to self-protect, because he knew that the Father was not just in the scene, but the Father was in the scene to be with him. Now, for those of us who grew up when they actually taught you not for the test, but taught you to actually know something. I ain't throwing shade on the good teachers who are here. But when there wasn't such pressure to get you to test well, but to understand things deeply, right? So we learn penmanship. We learn how to write. We learn phonics. We diagrammed sentences. And then we had to diagram paragraphs. I'm talking about way back. These kids, they'll diagram. What's that? Penmanship, what's that? No. Phonics and grammar. Anybody know about grammar? You know, we didn't have anything that checked our grammar. We had to know our grammar. And therefore we had to know subject-verb agreement and pronoun agreement. And we had to know about adverbial and adjective placement. Right? Am I talking about anything basic education? Well, this word with is a preposition. Huh? Am I right? Where are my English teachers? It's a preposition, and it means in accord, in allegiance, in solidarity, in support, in the company of, and escorted by. Lord have mercy. I love looking up the meaning of words. This speaks to the disposition of God within this scene, in the midst of everyone else's motives being mixed and stances being fickle, Jesus knew that God's disposition towards him was positive and ongoing. God was there with him. God was there in support, in company, in accord, in allegiance. Friends, you are able to fast spiritual self-protection by believing God's safety for the with category. Like Jesus, our sense of safety must mature to the point that believing that the God who doesn't keep us from challenges, does not keep us from challenging people, is right there in the midst thereof, and he is there to be with us. His presence isn't just to be there. He's not a spectator. He is there to be with you. He is there in connection. He is there in solidarity. He is there in support. He is there as an escort, as a guide, as a leader. You can feel safe in God's covering, being found in the with category. This sense of safety and covering being found in the with category is buttressed by the assurance that the God who is with you is the God who is also for you. And if God be for you, who can be against you? Who has the ability to withstand the God who is in the scene with you and who is for you? Who knows more than that God does? Who has more power and authority than that God does? Who can last longer than that God lasts? And that's why when Moses raises his insecurity due to Pharaoh and the might of Egypt, God just says, certainly I will be with you. When Joshua felt intimidated by the prospect of succeeding Moses, God just says, as I was with Moses, so will I be with you. To Israel feeling insecure about the exile and what life would be like after they came out of exile, God just says to them through Isaiah, fear not, for I have redeemed you. I've called you by name. You are mine. And when you pass through the waters, I'll be with you. And through the rivers, they shall not overflow you. When you walk through the fire, you shall not be burned, nor shall the flame scorch you. Fear not, for I am with you. I will bring your descendants from the east and gather you from the west. God is calling somebody right now to shed your self-protection by believing that God has you covered with the with category. He is with you. He is your escort. He is your guide. Talk to me, David. The Lord is my shepherd. I shall not want. He makes me to lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside still waters. He restores my soul. He leads me in the paths of righteousness for his name's sake. And yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I'll fear no evil, for thou art with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. You anoint my head with oil, and my cup runs over. And surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I'll dwell in the house of the Lord forever. Anybody know about God and the with category? With you, he's been a rock in a weary land and a shelter in the time of storm. With you, he's been your glory and the lifter of your head. With you, he's been the one who's heard your cries, pitied your groans, dried your tears, encouraged your soul. With you, he's been mother and father. He's been a friend that sticks closer than a brother. With you, he's been a bridge over troubled waters, a doctor in the sick room, a lawyer in a courtroom. With you, he's been insulation in fire and buoyancy in water. With you right now, he's being your strength. He's being your peace. He's being your comfort. He's being your joy in the with category. Oh yeah, you can feel safe when you know God got you covered in the with category. He's got you covered in the in category. But then not just believing God for the in and the with category, but we also fast spiritual self-protection by being safe with God in terms of the through category. As Jesus looks around at the crowd, knowing them to be fickle, looks at the religious leaders, knowing them to be against him, looks at the disciples, knowing them to be a little clueless. He puts his eyes on God. And what he sees about God puts him in the moment. His focus on God being in the moment and God being with him and for him in the moment motivates him to enjoy the moment. So that even when the religious leaders try to spoil the moment by saying to Jesus, Jesus, why don't you rebuke them for saying stuff like that? Why don't you tamper that stuff down? Why don't you quiet them? Why don't you stop them from celebrating you? Jesus says, well, I tell you what, if they keep quiet, the rocks will cry out. In other words, Jesus said, I ain't going to let you mess up the moment. I'm going to enjoy the moment for what it is. He would not even allow an anticipation of the worst on tomorrow keep him from enjoying the best of today. He would revel and savor the good while it was good. Can I set somebody free today? Can I tell you this one thing? Don't let your anticipation of the worst rob you from experiencing the best. Don't let your apprehension of something bad happening in your future keep you from enjoying the good that is happening in the present. Celebrate the good. Enjoy the good. Savor the good. Revel in the good. If you are in a new relationship and things are going well, don't you mess it up by anticipating what they might do in the future. You enjoy them being good now, and then let tomorrow take care of itself. Lord have mercy. Tell your neighbor, he's preaching to you even though you don't know it. Jesus reveled in the good by trusting God for the future challenges. He knew the crowd was fickle. He knew the religious leaders were plotting. He knew the disciples were clueless, but he trusted God with them all. He trusted God with the moments to come. He said, I'm going to enjoy this moment and put the future moments in the hand of God. Because he said, I trust God to see me through them. As God was working with the current moment to fulfill his purpose, so God would work with all of the future moments to fulfill his purposes. As God was utilizing their celebration to fulfill his purposes, so God would use the cries for crucifixion to fulfill his purposes. In all of it, Jesus says God is going to see him through. God would see him through the betrayal, the denials, the false accusations, the unfair treatment, the beatings by the soldiers, the carrying of the cross, the being nailed to the cross, being lifted in the air, gravity dropping his body down, the spear in his side. God would be with him in death, in hell, and in the grave. And he trusted that God would be in it all and with him in it all. And he says that the God who will be with me in it all is going to be the God who will see me through it all. God would see him through it all. And sure enough, God was with him in it all, and sure enough, God did see him through it all, through the trial, through the crucifixion, through the death, through hell. God saw Jesus through it all, and God saw him into resurrection, into vindication, into victory, into fulfillment, and into glory. I got good news for somebody. That is the God who is with you in it all, is the God who will see you through it all. Slap five with your neighbor and say, neighbor, I can testify that the God who's been with me in it all is the God who's able to see you through it all, through the ups and the downs, through the ins and the outs, through the good and the bad, through the highs and the lows, through the triumphs and the tragedy, through your your delights and your disruptions. He's been with you in it all. He's been with you through it, in it all, and he's seen you through it all. Is there anybody here who can say the reason why I act the way that I act is because God has been with me in it all, and God has seen me through it all? As a matter of fact, he's seen me through it all in such a way that I don't look like all I've been in, because when he brought me through it all, he took some of it out of me, and I don't look like I ever been in it. Slap fire with your neighbor and say, neighbor, he's seen me through it all. And the good news is, just like Jesus, he'll see you through it all until he does it all, until he completes it all, until he shows it all, until he fulfills it all, until he manifests it all, until he brings it all, until he provides it all. Am I talking to anybody here who can say, I'm so glad that he stays with you until he does it all? As a matter of fact, slap fire with your neighbor and say, neighbor, God just had me tap you because God wanted me to let you know he's not finished. He's not done. He's not through. It's not over. It's not complete. He's got some more in store for you. He's got better in mind for you. He's got higher around the corner for you. Yes, as a matter of fact, it doth not yet appear what you shall be, but you know when he shall appear, you shall be like him, for you'll see him face to face, and you'll know just as you're known. So slap fire with your neighbor one last time and tell your neighbor, I'm safe in the arms of Jesus. I'm safe in his care. I'm safe in his guidance. I'm safe in his power. I'm safe in his wisdom. I'm safe in his purpose. Come what may, from day to day, he covers me with his feathers, and under his wings I'm able to trust. I dwell in the secret place of the Most High. I abide under the shadow of the Almighty. I'll say of the Lord, he's my refuge. He's my fortress. He's my buckler. He's my defense. Because in the time of trouble, he'll hide you in the secret of his pavilion. He'll hide you. Is there anybody? Can you tell your neighbor, I'm safe? I'm safe